The whispering shadows. In the quiet of dusk, just as the last golden rays of sunlight slipped beneath the horizon, the small Navajo town of Black Mesa began to stir with a different kind of life. The wind, once a gentle breeze, grew colder, biting against the skin of those brave enough to still be outside. As the shadows lengthened, whispers seemed to drift through the air, ancient voices carried on the wind. Nathan, a young man in his early 20s, adjusted his worn leather jacket and glanced nervously toward the hills that loomed in the distance. The stories about those hills, passed down by his grandmother, had always felt like just that, stories. But tonight, as he prepared for his hike to clear his mind, the stories weighed heavier than usual. Nathan's grandmother had often warned him of the Nalblushi, the skinwalker switches capable of shifting into animals, dark figures that could steal a person's soul with a single glance. As a child, he dismissed it as folklore, but now, with the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine, he wasn't so sure. He pulled a flashlight from his backpack, turning it on as he began his ascent up the narrow path toward the hills. The town behind him slowly disappeared, swallowed by the thickening dark. Above, the sky deepened into a starry canvas, the silence only broken by the occasional caw of a distant raven. The higher Nathan climbed, the more his mind returned to the strange events of the last few weeks. Livestock had gone missing from several farms, vanishing without a trace. Some of the older folks had whispered about the skinwalker, but Nathan had dismissed it as wolves or coyotes. But when his own dog, Rex, disappeared 3 nights ago without a sound, he found himself unable to shake the feeling that something far worse was happening. At the crest of the hill, Nathan paused, breathing heavily. Below, the expansive desert stretched out like a vast ocean of darkness, the outline of the town barely visible. He turned to face the path ahead. Just beyond the ridge lay the ruins of an old ceremonial Citayan ancient place his grandmother had warned him never to approach. She believed it was a place where dark magic still lingered, a place that should be avoided at all costs. But Nathan wasn't the superstitious type, not really. He had made it this far, and he needed answers. There had to be a reason for the strange occurrences, and if he found nothing but a bunch of rocks and dirt, maybe he could finally move on from the gnawing fear that had gripped him for weeks. As Nathan stepped over the ridge, his flashlight flickered. He cursed under his breath, hitting the side of it. The light steadied, illuminating the path ahead. The air here felt different, thicker, colder. His breath came out in visible puffs, and a faint rustling sound echoed from somewhere in the distance. Nathan stopped. His heart pounded in his chest as the rustling grew louder, moving closer. He aimed his flashlight in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing, just more desert, more darkness. "Rex?" he called, his voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. There was no answer. He stood still, listening, waiting. The rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Nathan's skin prickled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He felt watched, like something was lurking just beyond the reach of his light. Then, just as he was about to turn back, he saw Ita's shape in the distance, moving silently along the ridge. It was tall, humanoid, but something was wrong. Its movements were too quick, too smooth, as if it didn't belong in this world. The figure crouched low to the ground, its glowing eyes locking onto Nathan's. Panic surged through him. He knew without a doubt what he was seeing. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else. A skinwalker. Nathan stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering again as the creature began to move toward him. He turned and ran, the sound of his own heartbeat drowning out everything else. He could hear the creature behind him, its footsteps too light, too fast. He sprinted down the narrow path, the jagged rocks cutting at his legs, but he didn't stop. The town lights were far below, but they felt a lifetime away. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but the terror kept him moving. He could feel the skinwalker closing in, its presence like a cold shadow pressing against his back. As he reached the base of the hill, Nathan's foot caught on a rock, and he tumbled forward, hitting the ground hard, His flashlight slipped from his grip and rolled away, its beam casting strange shadows across the landscape. Dazed and gasping for air, Nathan scrambled to his feet. He could see the creature now, standing at the top of the hill, silhouetted against the night sky. It didn't chase him. It didn't need to. It simply watched, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Nathan staggered backward, his heart pounding in his ears. The skinwalker raised a hand that was not entirely human, its fingers long and clawed. In the stillness, Nathan heard a voice, not out loud but in his mind, whispering words in a language he didn't understand. It was calling to him. He turned and ran again, this time not stopping until he reached the outskirts of town, where the lights of homes and the sound of distant voices gave him the slightest sense of safety. But even then, as he stumbled into the street, his breath coming in ragged gasps, Nathan knew one thing for certain. The skinwalker wasn't finished with him. Nathan barely slept that night. His heart was still pounding from his encounter with the skinwalker, and every noise outside his window made him jump. He could still see it in his mind, those glowing eyes, that eerie, unnatural shape stalking him across the ridge. He tossed and turned, but the dread followed him even into his dreams. When the first light of dawn finally crept through his window, Nathan got out of bed, groggy but determined. He couldn't live like this, afraid, unsure of what he had seen. He needed to talk to someone who might understand. His grandmother would know what to do. After a quick shower, he threw on some clothes and made his way across town to her small adobe house on the edge of Black Mesa. The morning was quiet, with only the sounds of birds and the distant hum of cars as the town slowly woke up. But even in the daylight, Nathan felt uneasy, as if the skinwalker was still out there, watching from the shadows. When he reached his grandmother's house, he hesitated for a moment. She had always been so adamant about the dangers of the skinwalkers, about staying away from the hills, about respecting the old ways. She would be angry with him for going up there, but Nathan knew he didn't have a choice. He needed help, and she was the only one who could provide it. He knocked lightly on the door, and after a moment it opened with a creak. His grandmother, a small, wrinkled woman with silver hair tied back in a braid, looked up at him with piercing eyes. "Nathan," she said, her voice firm but warm, "you're here early. Come inside." Nathan stepped into the cool, dimly lit house, the familiar smell of sage and cedar wood filling the air. His grandmother motioned for him to sit at the small wooden table in the kitchen, and she poured him a cup of tea without asking. "You look troubled," she said, sitting across from him. "What's happened?" Nathan hesitated, not sure where to begin. He wrapped his hands around the warm cup and stared down into the tea, gathering his thoughts. Finally he spoke. "I saw something last night," he said quietly. "Up in the hills. It wasn't an animal. It was something else." His grandmother's expression didn't change, but Nathan could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. She remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "It was like a person, but not," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It had these glowing eyes, and it was watching me. I ran, but I could feel it following me. I know what it was." "It was a skinwalker, wasn't it?" His grandmother's lips pressed into a thin line. She took a deep breath, and for a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. "You should not have gone up there," she finally said, her voice stern. "I've told you, Nathan, that land is dangerous. The skinwalkers are real, and they are not to be taken lightly." "I know, Grandma," Nathan said, running a hand through his hair, "but I didn't think it was real until I saw it. Now I don't know what to do." His grandmother stood and moved toward a small shelf on the far wall, where various herbs and sacred objects were carefully arranged. She took down a bundle of sage and a small leather pouch, then returned to the table. "You are marked now," she said softly, placing the items in front of him. "Once a skinwalker sets its eyes on you, it will not stop. It will come for you, Nathan, again and again, until it has what it wants." Nathan's stomach tightened with fear. "What does it want?" "Your spirit," his grandmother said, her voice grave. Your life, your essence. Skinwalkers thrive on fear and death. They use their powers to transform into animals or take on the likeness of someone you trust. They play with your mind, your heart, and if you are not careful, they will destroy you. Nathan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had known the stories, but hearing his grandmother speak of the skinwalker with such certainty made the threat all the more real. What can I do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His grandmother placed her hand over his. There are ways to protect yourself, but you must be strong. Fear is what gives the skinwalker its power. You must face it, but not on its terms. I will prepare a protection ritual for you, but you need to avoid that place. Do you understand? Nathan nodded, though the fear in his chest hadn't lessened. He wasn't sure how he would avoid the hills when every fiber of his being told him that whatever the skinwalker wanted, it wouldn't stop at just watching. Stay close to the house tonight, his grandmother said, standing. I'll burn sage and chant to keep the evil at bay. But you must remain vigilant, Nathan. The skinwalker will come for you again. Nathan stood as well, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His grandmother handed him the small leather pouch, which smelled faintly of cedar and juniper. This is a protection charm, she said. Wear it at all times. It will help shield you from the skinwalker's influence, but it won't be enough on its own. You must stay strong, in your heart and in your mind. Do you understand? Yeah, Nathan said, slipping the pouch into his pocket. I'll be careful. His grandmother gave him a long, searching look. Good. Now go home, and remember, if you see it again, do not engage. Do not let it into your thoughts. Nathan nodded and headed toward the door, his mind racing with questions and fears. As he stepped out into the morning light, the weight of what lay ahead settled heavily on his shoulders. The skinwalker had marked him, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it came for. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a bruised shade of purple, Nathan found himself pacing the narrow confines of his small house. Every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind outside sent his nerves twitching. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind, "The skinwalker will come for you again." He pulled the protection charm from his pocket and held it tightly, feeling its rough texture press into his palm. The smell of cedar and juniper from the pouch mixed with the faint scent of sage that lingered on his clothes from the ritual his grandmother had performed earlier. He wanted to believe it was enough, that the rituals and the charm could keep him safe. But deep down, he knew this thing was relentless. The landline phone on the kitchen counter rang, startling him out of his thoughts. He snatched it up, expecting his grandmother to be checking in. "Nathan," her voice came through, steady but filled with tension, "you must be careful tonight. I felt a disturbance during the ritual. It's stronger than I expected." "What do you mean?" Nathan asked, gripping the phone tighter. "The skinwalker is old, powerful," she continued, her voice tinged with fear. "It's not just any skinwalker, it's one of the ancient ones. They hold grudges, Nathan. It must have been waiting for someone like you to wander too close." Nathan swallowed hard. "But you said the ritual would protect me. It will help, but you must trust your instincts. Do not give in to fear. The more fear it senses, the more power it gains." He heard a rustle outside, a sound too deliberate to be the wind. He froze, holding his breath as he listened. The wind died down, leaving only silence. But there it was again, a soft scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. "I think it's here," he whispered into the phone, his voice trembling. There was a long pause on the other end. "Nathan, listen to me. Stay inside. Do not open the door, no matter what you hear. I'm coming over. I'll bring more protection." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Okay, I'll wait." He hung up the phone and stood in the middle of the living room, his heart racing. The sound outside grew louder, closer. It wasn't just his imagination. Something or someone was circling his house. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks that sent a shiver down Nathan's spine. "Do not open the door, no matter what you hear," his grandmother's warning repeated in his mind. But then, a voice came from the other side. "Nathan? It's me, Adam. Open up, man." Nathan's pulse quickened. Adam? His best friend? What was he doing here? His first instinct was to rush to the door and open it, but something stopped him. Adam had no reason to be out here, especially this late. And why would he come all the way to Nathan's house unannounced? The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Come on, Nathan. I need to talk to you." Nathan took a step back from the door, his mind racing. His grandmother had warned him that skinwalkers could imitate voices, even take the form of someone familiar. But this sounded just like Adam. It was uncanny. I can't let you in," Nathan called through the door, his voice shaking. "Not until I know it's really you." A pause. Then the voice turned cold, sharp. "Let me in, Nathan." Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The tone was different now, dripping with malice. He backed away from the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice outside grew more insistent, pounding on the door. "Open the door!" it shouted, the voice no longer sounding like Adam. It was deeper now, guttural, almost inhuman. The pounding grew louder, shaking the walls of the small house. Nathan grabbed the pouch from his pocket, clutching it tightly in his hand. He could feel the energy from the charm, faint but present, like a small barrier between him and the thing outside. The skinwalker was trying to break through, trying to get into his mind. The pounding on the door stopped suddenly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Nathan stood frozen, every muscle in his body tense, waiting for the next move. Then, he heard a sound from behind him, soft footsteps, moving across the wooden floor. He turned slowly, his heart in his throat. Standing in the doorway to the kitchen was Rex, his missing dog. The black and white border collie wagged its tail and tilted its head, looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Rex?" Nathan whispered, taking a step toward the dog. Relief flooded his chest. His dog had come back. But as Nathan moved closer, something in the back of his mind screamed for him to stop. His grandmother's warning echoed again. "It will play with your mind. Take the form of someone you trust." Rex's eyes were too bright, too sharp. The way the dog moved too deliberate, too calculated. Nathan stopped in his tracks, his blood running cold. This wasn't Rex. It couldn't be. The dog tilted its head, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. Then, slowly, it opened its mouth. "Nathan." The voice rasped, not at all like a dog's, but something twisted and wrong. "Let me in." Nathan stumbled back, his hand clutching the pouch tighter than ever. The thing that wore Rex's skin began to shift, its form twisting and contorting, becoming less dog and more something else. Its limbs stretched, its back arched unnaturally, and its face elongated into something that was neither human nor animal. The skinwalker. It took a step toward him, its eyes gleaming with hunger, its mouth opening wide in a grotesque smile. Nathan turned and ran, racing for the back door. He could hear the thing behind him, its twisted laughter echoing through the house. His heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled with the door handle, yanking it open and stumbling outside into the cold night air. He sprinted across the yard, the skinwalker's laughter following him, chilling him to the bone. He could feel its presence behind him, a dark, suffocating force that seemed to close in with every step. Nathan ran toward the hills, toward the place his grandmother had warned him never to go. But now, it seemed like the only option, the only place where the skinwalker could be defeated. Nathan sprinted through the open desert, the cold night air stinging his lungs. Behind him, the twisted laughter of the skinwalker echoed, growing louder with every step he took. His legs ached, but he didn't dare slow down. The darkness pressed in around him, but he kept his eyes fixed on the hills in the distance. He didn't know why he was heading there, only that something deep inside told him it was his only hope. As he ran, the landscape seemed to shift and twist under the pale light of the moon. Familiar landmarks disappeared, and the terrain grew more jagged and uneven. It was as though the skinwalker was distorting the world around him, bending it to its will. Nathan glanced over his shoulder. The creature wasn't far behind, its shape flickering and shifting between forms. Sometimes it appeared as a large, hulking coyote, other times as a gaunt, skeletal figure cloaked in shadow. Its eyes glowed, twin points of malevolent light cutting through the dark. He turned his attention back to the hills, his heart pounding. The ground beneath his feet became rockier, the path steeper as he approached the ridge where he had first encountered the creature. His thoughts raced, his mind barely able to process what was happening. He had no plan, no idea how to fight this thing, only the instinctual drive to survive. As Nathan reached the base of the hills, he stumbled, catching himself on a sharp rock. He winced in pain but forced himself to keep moving. The ceremonial site was close, he could feel it. His grandmother had warned him to stay away, but something about the place called to him now. Maybe there was a way to end this nightmare, to stop the skinwalker once and for all. The wind howled as Nathan climbed higher, the twisted cries of the creature blending with the sound of the gusts. The moonlight illuminated the path ahead, casting eerie shadows on the rocky terrain. Finally, he reached the top of the ridge and stood before the ancient ruins. The site was smaller than he remembered, a circle of crumbling stones that had once been sacred to the Navajo people. The air here felt different, charged with a strange energy that made Nathan's skin crawl. He took a hesitant step forward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Suddenly, the skinwalker appeared at the edge of the clearing. Its form flickered and twisted, shifting between a man, an animal, and something monstrous. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its mouth curled into a cruel smile. "Nathan," the creature hissed, its voice a grotesque blend of human and animal. "You cannot escape. You belong to me now." Nathan's hand instinctively went to the pouch his grandmother had given him. He clutched it tightly, feeling the faint warmth of the protective charm. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. The skinwalker was too powerful, too ancient. He needed something more. The creature stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring the fear radiating from Nathan. The ground beneath Nathan's feet seemed to pulse with energy, and he realized with a sinking feeling that the skinwalker was drawing strength from the very land itself. "You are weak," the skinwalker continued, its voice mocking. "Your fear feeds me. Your soul will be mine." Nathan backed away, his mind racing. He couldn't let the fear consume him. He needed to think, to find a way to fight back. His eyes darted around the clearing, searching for something that could help. His gaze fell on a large stone at the center of the circle. It was covered in strange markings, symbols that he didn't understand, but that seemed ancient, powerful. He didn't know what the stone was, or what it was used for, but he could feel its energy, faint but present, like a sliver of hope in the overwhelming darkness. The skinwalker lunged toward him, its long clawed hands reaching out. Nathan dodged to the side, barely avoiding its grasp. His heart raced as he sprinted toward the stone, his fingers brushing over the rough surface. The markings seemed to hum beneath his touch, as though reacting to his presence. Desperate, Nathan placed both hands on the stone and closed his eyes. He didn't know what he was doing, only that something deep inside told him this was his only chance. He focused on the symbols, willing them to come to life, to awaken whatever power they held. For a moment, nothing happened. The skinwalker laughed, a low, guttural sound that chilled Nathan to the bone. "Do you think this place can save you?" The creature sneered, its voice dripping with malice. "This land belongs to me." But then, just as the skinwalker reached out to strike, the ground beneath Nathan's feet began to tremble. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The stone beneath his hands pulsed with energy, the ancient symbols glowing faintly in the darkness. The skinwalker paused, its eyes narrowing in confusion. It could feel the shift in the air, the awakening of something old and powerful. The creature hissed in anger, lashing out at Nathan with renewed fury. Nathan felt a surge of power rush through him, coursing from the stone into his body. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, ancient, primal, and terrifying. But with it came a strange sense of clarity, as though he were tapping into something far older and greater than himself. The skinwalker lunged again, its claws outstretched, but this time, Nathan didn't flinch. He raised his hand, feeling the energy from the stone flow through him, and with a shout he released it. A blinding light erupted from his palm, slamming into the skinwalker and sending it flying backward. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream as the light consumed it, burning away its twisted form. The air crackled with energy as the skinwalker writhed in agony, its shape flickering wildly between man, beast, and shadow. Nathan watched, his heart racing, as the skinwalker dissolved into nothingness, its cries fading into the night. The light from the stone slowly dimmed, leaving only silence in its wake. He stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. The skinwalker was gone, its presence erased from the land. But the power that had flowed through him, the connection to the ancient stone, it lingered. Nathan released the stone and stumbled back, his legs weak. He looked around the clearing, half expecting the creature to reappear, but there was nothing. Only the stillness of the night and the faint rustle of the wind. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, but for the first time in days, the fear had lifted. The skinwalker was gone. He had survived. Nathan stood at the edge of the ancient site, his chest heaving as the last remnants of the skinwalker's presence faded into the night. The hills were silent now, the oppressive energy that had clung to them gone, leaving the air crisp and cold. But despite the victory, Nathan couldn't shake the strange sensation that lingered in his bones, as though the power from the stone still hummed faintly beneath his skin. He glanced at his hands, half expecting them to glow, but they looked the same as always, just trembling fingers covered in dust and sweat. Whatever had happened, whatever energy he had tapped into, it had passed, leaving him drained but alive. As the adrenaline ebbed, exhaustion took over, and Nathan felt the weight of the night pressing down on him. His legs wobbled, and he sank to the ground, leaning back against one of the ancient stones. For a moment he just sat there, staring up at the sky, letting the stillness settle over him. The stars twinkled above, bright and cold, indifferent to the battle that had just taken place below. Nathan's thoughts drifted to his grandmother, to the warnings she had given him, to the stories she had told him growing up. He had always thought they were just that, stories. But now, after everything he had seen, he realized how deeply connected to the land, to the old ways she had always been. She would be worried about him by now, he realized. He needed to get home, to let her know that he was okay. He needed to understand what had happened, and he knew she would have answers. With a groan, Nathan pushed himself to his feet, his body aching from the ordeal. He cast one last glance at the ancient stone, its markings barely visible now in the faint light. He didn't know what it was or why it had been here for so long, but he was certain that it had saved him. The hike down the ridge was slower than his frantic escape earlier. His limbs felt heavy, and his thoughts were clouded with exhaustion. He couldn't shake the feeling that the skinwalker's presence had marked him in some way, even though it was gone. He had tapped into something ancient and dangerous, something that might have changed him in ways he didn't yet understand. By the time he reached his house, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. The small adobe house looked almost peaceful, like nothing had changed, but Nathan knew better. He could feel the shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, as though something in the world had realigned itself. His grandmother was waiting for him on the porch. She sat in her rocking chair, wrapped in a thick blanket, her silver hair glowing softly in the early morning light. As soon as Nathan approached, she stood up, her sharp eyes scanning him, taking in every detail. "You're alive," she said, her voice heavy with relief. "Thank the spirits." Nathan nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to see her, to know that she was still here, still watching over him. "It's over, Grandma. The skinwalker, it's gone." She stepped forward, placing her hands gently on his shoulders, her eyes searching his face. I felt it. The darkness lifted. "But you've changed." Nathan looked down at the ground, unsure of what to say. How could he explain what had happened, how he had used the power of the ancient stone? How could he even begin to understand it himself? "I don't know what I did," he admitted softly. "I was so scared, and then something happened. The stone up in the hillside gave me power. I used it to stop the skinwalker." His grandmother's face softened, and she nodded slowly, as though she had expected this all along. "The stones have always been there, protecting the land, waiting for someone who could harness their power. You were meant to find them, Nathan. The spirits guided you to that place for a reason." "But what does it mean?" Nathan asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "What happens now?" His grandmother took his hand, her grip strong despite her age. "Now, you must learn to live with what you've done. The power you felt, it's a part of you now. But it is not to be taken lightly. The old ways are powerful, but they are also dangerous. You must respect them, or they will consume you." Nathan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. He didn't want this powerhead, didn't ask for it. But now, it was his, and he had no choice but to accept it. "Come inside," his grandmother said, guiding him toward the door. "We will talk more, but first you need rest. The battle may be over, but your journey has only just begun." Nathan followed her into the house, the warmth and familiarity of the small adobe space offering a brief respite from the darkness he had faced. But even as he sat down at the kitchen table, the events of the night replayed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. Something irreversible. As the morning light filtered through the windows, Nathan closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion wash over him. He had survived the skinwalker, but he knew that this was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning. Days passed, but Nathan couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. He stayed close to home, spending most of his time with his grandmother, trying to understand the strange power that now hummed beneath his skin. She taught him what she could about the old ways, the spirits that watched over their land, and the balance that had to be maintained between the living and the unseen forces that roamed the earth. But even she couldn't fully explain what had happened that night on the ridge. "You've touched something few ever do," she told him one evening as they sat by the fire. "The ancient power in those stone sits not meant for everyone. But now that you've connected with it, you must be careful. The land remembers, and so do the spirits." Nathan had always believed in the old stories, but living through one was something else entirely. He found himself questioning everything, his place in the world, his connection to the land, and the strange new presence that seemed to lurk in the corners of his mind. It was as if the encounter with the skinwalker had opened a door inside him, one that couldn't be closed. And then, there were the dreams. Every night he was haunted by visions, fleeting glimpses of shadows moving through the desert, of twisted shapes slipping between the rocks, watching him from the edges of his consciousness. In these dreams, the skinwalker wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment to strike again. One night, after another restless sleep filled with dark visions, Nathan woke with a start. The room was bathed in pale moonlight, casting long shadows on the walls. He could feel something was off, a strange tension in the air that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The house was silent, but the unease that had been growing inside him for days was now unbearable. He got up, moving quietly through the small house, careful not to wake his grandmother. As he stepped outside, the cold night air hit him, sharp and biting. The desert stretched out before him, quiet and still under the moon's gaze. But something felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. Nathan's eyes scanned the horizon, and that's when he saw Ida's figure, standing at the edge of the property, just beyond the line of juniper trees. It was tall and thin, its shape barely visible in the shadows. But even from a distance, Nathan could feel the malevolent presence radiating from it. His breath caught in his throat. The skinwalker, but how? He had destroyed it. He had felt it dissolve into nothingness. Hadn't he? The figure didn't move, just stood there watching. Nathan's hand instinctively went to the pouch of protection that he still carried with him, even inside the house. But this time the charm felt weaker, like it wasn't enough. His mind raced as he took a step back, retreating toward the door. But before he could move any further, the figure began to shift, its form twisting and bending in the moonlight. It wasn't the skinwalker, not exactly. This was something else, something darker, older. Nathan's grandmother's words echoed in his mind, "The land remembers." And so do the spirits. Had his battle with the skinwalker disturbed something deeper, something more dangerous? The figure took a step forward, and Nathan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what this thing was, but he knew he couldn't face it alone. He turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door behind him. His hands shook as he locked it, though deep down he knew that wouldn't stop whatever was out there. He rushed to his grandmother's room, finding her already awake, sitting up in bed with a knowing look in her eyes. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked quietly. Nathan nodded, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "What is it?" "I thought I defeated the skinwalker, but now there's something else out there." His grandmother sighed and gestured for him to sit beside her. The skinwalker was just one part of a larger whole, Nathan. The old ones, the spirits that protect this land, they don't take kindly to disruption. You called upon their power, but there is always a price to pay. You disturbed the balance, and now something is coming for you. Nathan's stomach twisted. "What do you mean, a price?" "I didn't ask for this power, I just wanted to survive." His grandmother's eyes softened. "I know, child, but the spirits do not see things the way we do. By tapping into their power, you became a part of their world, and now they want something in return." "What do they want from me?" Nathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His grandmother shook her head. "I don't know. But I do know this: whatever is out there, it's not just after you. It's after your soul, your very essence. It wants to take what you've gained, to make sure that the balance is restored." Nathan felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard stories about the spirits of the land, the way they could protect or destroy depending on their mood. But he had never imagined he would be caught up in their ancient struggles. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. His grandmother stood up slowly, moving to a small chest at the foot of her bed. She opened it and pulled out a long, twisted staff made of dark wood, intricately carved with symbols that Nathan didn't recognize. "You must face it," she said, handing the staff to him. "This is no longer just a fight for survival, Nathan. It's a battle for your soul. You must confront the spirit and find a way to appease it, or it will consume you." Nathan took the staff, feeling its weight in his hands. The carving seemed to pulse faintly under his touch, as though the wood itself was alive with the same ancient power he had felt before. He looked at his grandmother, fear and uncertainty churning inside him. "But what if I can't stop it? What if I'm not strong enough?" She placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "You are strong enough. You've already proven that. But this will not be easy. You must trust in yourself and in the spirits that guide you." Nathan nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. But he knew he had no choice. Whatever was out there, waiting for him in the dark, it wasn't going to stop. And neither could he. Nathan stood at the edge of the desert, the staff gripped tightly in his hands, the cold night air pressing against his skin. His grandmother had prepared him as best she could. But now he was alone. The figure he had seen the night before, the ancient spirit or creature, whatever it was out there, waiting for him. This wasn't a battle for survival anymore. This was a battle for his soul. The desert was eerily quiet. Even the wind had stilled, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale glow over the landscape, and Nathan could feel the weight of the staff in his hands, the same strange energy he had felt when he touched the ancient stone on the ridge. The path before him led deeper into the desert, away from the safety of the house and the lights of the town. His heart raced as he moved forward, the staff tapping against the hard-packed earth with each step. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew the spirit would find him soon enough. As he walked, the land seemed to shift around him, the familiar shapes of the desert blurring and twisting in the moonlight. The air grew colder, and Nathan felt a creeping sense of dread slither through his body. He gripped the staff tighter, trying to keep his fear at bay. He had faced the skinwalker and survived. He could face this too. And then it appeared. The figure emerged from the shadows, standing just ahead of him in the open desert. It was taller than before, its form more defined human, yet not. Its limbs were elongated, its body gaunt and twisted, but it still bore the same malevolent energy as the skinwalker. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, locked onto Nathan, and a low, guttural growl escaped its throat. Nathan's breath hitched. He could feel the power radiating from the creature, stronger than before. This was no ordinary spirit. This was something ancient, something that had been disturbed by his encounter with the skinwalker, and now it wanted him. It wanted what he had taken. The creature took a step toward him, its movements slow and deliberate. Nathan raised the staff, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly in the moonlight. He didn't know what to do, but the staff hummed with energy, like it was trying to guide him. "You've come for me," Nathan said, his voice trembling but defiant. "But I won't let you take me." The creature's twisted face contorted into something resembling a smile, though it was anything but comforting. "You disturbed the balance," it hissed, its voice like dry leaves scraping across the ground. "You called upon the ancient power, and now it demands a price." Nathan swallowed hard, his hands shaking. "What price?" "Your soul," the creature replied, stepping closer. "The land remembers. The spirits remember. You cannot touch the power of the old ones and walk away unscathed." Nathan's pulse raced, but he stood his ground. "I didn't ask for this. I was just trying to survive." The creature tilted its head, its eyes narrowing. "Survival comes at a cost. You have tapped into something greater than yourself. Now you must pay." Nathan took a step back, his mind racing. The ancient stories, the warnings his grandmother had given him, they were all coming true. But he wasn't ready to give in. He had fought too hard, survived too much, to lose his soul now. The staff in his hands pulsed again, and Nathan felt a surge of energy course through him. He didn't understand it, but he knew that this was the key. The staff, the ancient symbol set, was connected to the power he had tapped into. And if he could use that power once, he could use it again. The creature lunged at him, moving faster than Nathan had anticipated. He barely had time to react as it closed the distance between them, its claws reaching out for him. But in that moment, instinct took over. Nathan thrust the staff forward, channeling the energy that flowed through him. A blinding light erupted from the staff just as it had on the ridge. The force of it knocked the creature back, its twisted form writhing and convulsing as the light consumed it. Nathan gritted his teeth, focusing all his will into the staff, pushing the energy toward the creature, determined to end this once and for all. The creature let out a scream, a sound so inhuman and filled with rage that it sent chills down Nathan's spine. It clawed at the air, trying to resist, but the light was too strong. Its form began to dissolve, just as the skinwalker had, its dark presence unraveling in the moonlit desert. Nathan watched as the creature disintegrated into nothingness, its screams fading into the night. The light from the staff dimmed, and the desert was silent once more. He stood there panting, the staff still glowing faintly in his hands. It was over. The creature was gone. But Nathan knew, deep down, that something had changed within him. He had tapped into a power older than time itself, and even though he had survived, he would never be the same. Slowly, he lowered the staff and looked up at the sky. The stars twinkled overhead, just as they always had, but the world felt different. Lighter, perhaps. Or maybe it was just him who had changed. He started back toward the house, his legs heavy with exhaustion, but his mind strangely clear. He had faced the darkness and come out the other side, but he knew this was not the end. The old ways, the spirits they would always be with him now, watching, waiting. When he reached the house, his grandmother was waiting for him on the porch, just as she had been the night before. She didn't say anything as he approached, just nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "You did it," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet pride. Nathan nodded, though he felt no sense of victory. "But the power, it's still with me. It's not over, is it?" His grandmother shook her head. "No, it never is. But you've proven yourself, Nathan. You've shown the spirits that you respect the balance. And now, they will watch over you." Nathan looked out at the desert, at the quiet expanse of land that stretched out before him. The spirits would always be with him now, a part of him. He had survived the skinwalker, defeated the ancient creature, but the land, the power, it would never let him go. And perhaps, he thought, that was exactly as it should be. The days passed quietly after the final confrontation, though the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air. Nathan could feel it, as though the desert itself was watching him more closely now, the spirits of the land acknowledging him in a way they hadn't before. He had faced the darkness, and though he had survived, he knew that the power he had connected with was far from gone. In the mornings he would sit with his grandmother, sipping coffee as the sun rose over the horizon, casting the desert in hues of gold and crimson. There was a new calm between them, an unspoken understanding that the old stories, the ones he had once dismissed as myths, were all too real. His grandmother didn't have to say much. Her wisdom was etched into every glance, every small smile. She'd always known the land's power, had always understood the spirits that lived within it. Now, Nathan did too. But with that knowledge came responsibility. "You know what this means, don't you?" his grandmother asked one evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "You've touched the power of the old ones. You can never walk away from it now." Nathan nodded, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea, its warmth grounding him. He had felt the truth of her words ever since that night. The power was inside him, a part of him now. He had drawn from it in his fight against the skinwalker and the ancient creature, and in doing so, he had become tied to the land in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. "I didn't want this power. But now that I have it, I don't know how to live with it." His grandmother turned to him, her eyes full of understanding and love. "The spirits chose you, Nathan. They don't choose lightly. They see something in you that is strong, something that can carry the weight of the land's power without being destroyed by it. You must honor that." "But how?" Nathan asked, his frustration creeping in. "How do I live with something I don't even understand?" His grandmother smiled gently. "By respecting it, by respecting the balance. The spirits will guide you, but you must listen. The land is alive, and it speaks to those who are willing to hear." Nathan thought about her words, letting them settle deep in his mind. The power he had tapped into wasn't something to be feared or rejected, it was something to be honored. He had disrupted the balance once, and he had nearly paid the price with his soul. But now, he had a chance to set things right, to live in harmony with the land and the spirits that protected it. That night, as Nathan lay in bed, he found his dreams were different. No longer were they filled with shadows and twisted shapes. Instead, he saw the desert in its full glory, vast and ancient, stretching out beneath a brilliant sky. He felt the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, the hum of the spirits in the wind, and in the distance he saw figure shapes of the old ones, watching over him, not with malice but with a quiet approval. He woke in the early hours of the morning, just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The air was cool and fresh, and for the first time in weeks, Nathan felt truly at peace. The weight of the past was still with him, but now it was a part of him, a reminder of what he had faced and what he had become. As the sun rose, Nathan stepped outside, feeling the cool desert breeze on his skin. The land stretched out before him, vast and endless, and for the first time, he didn't feel lost. He was a part of this place, now connected to the earth in ways he had never imagined. The spirits had chosen him, and though the path ahead was uncertain, he knew he would walk it with honor. His grandmother joined him on the porch, her movements slow but steady. She didn't say anything, just stood beside him, watching the sunrise. They didn't need words. The bond between them, between their family and the land, was stronger than ever. Nathan had faced the darkness, had seen the true power of the land and the spirits that guarded it. But now, he understood. The balance wasn't something to be feared, it was something to be embraced. He had become a part of the ancient stories, a living connection to the past, and though his journey had been difficult, it had led him to a place of peace. As the first rays of sunlight warmed his skin, Nathan took a deep breath, feeling the power of the land settle around him like an old friend. The spirits would always be with him, guiding him, watching over him. And now, he was ready to listen. The days passed quietly after the final confrontation, though the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air. Nathan could feel it, as though the desert itself was watching him more closely now, the spirits of the land acknowledging him in a way they hadn't before. He had faced the darkness, and though he had survived, he knew that the power he had connected with was far from gone. In the mornings he would sit with his grandmother, sipping coffee as the sun rose over the horizon, casting the desert in hues of gold and crimson. There was a new calm between them, an unspoken understanding that the old stories, the ones he had once dismissed as myths, were all too real. His grandmother didn't have to say much. Her wisdom was etched into every glance, every small smile. She'd always known the land's power, had always understood the spirits that lived within it. Now, Nathan did too. But with that knowledge came responsibility. "You know what this means, don't you?" his grandmother asked one evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "You've touched the power of the old ones. You can never walk away from it now." Nathan nodded, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea, its warmth grounding him. He had felt the truth of her words ever since that night. The power was inside him, a part of him now. He had drawn from it in his fight against the skinwalker and the ancient creature, and in doing so, he had become tied to the land in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. "I didn't want this power. But now that I have it, I don't know how to live with it." His grandmother turned to him, her eyes full of understanding and love. "The spirits chose you, Nathan. They don't choose lightly. They see something in you that is strong, something that can carry the weight of the land's power without being destroyed by it. You must honor that." "But how?" Nathan asked, his frustration creeping in. "How do I live with something I don't even understand?" His grandmother smiled gently. "By respecting it, by respecting the balance. The spirits will guide you, but you must listen. The land is alive, and it speaks to those who are willing to hear." Nathan thought about her words, letting them settle deep in his mind. The power he had tapped into wasn't something to be feared or rejected, it was something to be honored. He had disrupted the balance once, and he had nearly paid the price with his soul. But now, he had a chance to set things right, to live in harmony with the land and the spirits that protected it. That night, as Nathan lay in bed, he found his dreams were different. No longer were they filled with shadows and twisted shapes. Instead, he saw the desert in its full glory, vast and ancient, stretching out beneath a brilliant sky. He felt the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, the hum of the spirits in the wind, and in the distance he saw figure shapes of the old ones, watching over him, not with malice, but with a quiet approval. He woke in the early hours of the morning, just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The air was cool and fresh, and for the first time in weeks, Nathan felt truly at peace. The weight of the past was still with him, but now it was a part of him, a reminder of what he had faced and what he had become. As the sun rose, Nathan stepped outside, feeling the cool desert breeze on his skin. The land stretched out before him, vast and endless, and for the first time he didn't feel lost. He was a part of this place now, connected to the earth in ways he had never imagined. The spirits had chosen him, and though the path ahead was uncertain, he knew he would walk it with honor. His grandmother joined him on the porch, her movements slow but steady. She didn't say anything, just stood beside him, watching the sunrise. They didn't need words. The bond between them, between their family and the land, was stronger than ever. Nathan had faced the darkness, had seen the true power of the land and the spirits that guarded it. But now, he understood. The balance wasn't something to be feared, it was something to be embraced. He had become a part of the ancient stories, a living connection to the past, and though his journey had been difficult, it had led him to a place of peace. As the first rays of sunlight warmed his skin, Nathan took a deep breath, feeling the power of the land settle around him like an old friend. The spirits would always be with him, guiding him, watching over him. And now he was ready to listen.